Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Photography for Design Week 5, composition and focal length. But predominantly tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about composition and what happens when you bring elements into and out of. Your frame. James Joyce, in his novel, his first novel, The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. In any case, I'm going to just read a few lines from this. Beauty expressed by the artist cannot awaken in us an emotion which is kinetic or a sensation which is purely physical. It awakens, or should awaken, an aesthetic stasis, an ideal pity or an ideal terror, a stasis called forth, prolonged, and at last dissolved by what I call the rhythm of beauty. Rhythm, said Stephen, is the first formal aesthetic relation of part to part in any aesthetic whole, or of an aesthetic whole to its part or parts, or of any part to the aesthetic whole of which it is a part, the rhythm of beauty. So let's look a little bit at that now, composition and rhythm. There's a number of tricks that you can immediately start to play with. Check it out. It's got great little tips there on what to look out for when you're composing. There's also a clip to another video by a guy called John Meyerowitz, who is a street photographer from New York City. And I believe he's got some really interesting insights. And he talks about what you put in the frame determines what the photograph is. And there's a little 5-minute clip here, which I'd like you to have a look at. Very inspiring. There's also now a couple of photographs I'm going to put up and get you to have a look at. One of the most impressive compositional masters, in my opinion, was Enric Cartier-Bresson, who was a French photographer who was active, I believe, from about 1920 to about 1960 as a photographer, and then he went on to become a painter. He actually preferred to paint. But he is considered one of the master compositional and street photographers, one of the earliest of that genre, really, along with perhaps Robert Capa, who was born in Budapest, Hungary, and died in China in 1954. He was a war photographer who covered the Second World War. You would know some of his photographs. There's another photographer I really like, who's a contemporary photographer by the name of Parr. I'll put up a few of his pieces and link to his site. And please go and look at these photographers and just see what they do with compositions. Some very interesting techniques. I would like to suggest that you look at Enric Cartier-Bresson's work as purely compositional. It definitely has narrative, but it's almost like he wasn't concerned so much with narrative. It's like he was a purely structurally compositional photographer. Whereas if you look at Joel Meyerowitz, he's very aware of a lot of those principles that Enric Cartier-Bresson and other peers worked with, compositional principles, but he went off into a bit more of a philosophical and spiritual direction, and he was perhaps more interested in emotion, you could say, capturing a single moment, and less formal with his geometric compositional principles. And then you've got Martin Parr, who breaks that even further, and he goes more into a sort of a snapshot approach. Again, his earlier work is a little bit more obviously and overtly compositional in its formality, but his later work it's almost like he's trying to leave aside any evidence that he's formally structuring his photographs. They actually do appear to be snapshot-like. However, I'd say that that's a bit like saying Picasso couldn't draw because he did things like what he did with Cubism. Whereas you look at his original work and he's a fine draftsman. So there's something going on here with these master photographers that I believe is heavily influenced by the geometry and the formality of compositional rules and aesthetic principles. So I suggest you start with the likes of Enric Cartier-Bresson, then look at a little bit of Joel Meyerowitz, and then Martin Parr. And there's also going to be a link through another website by Young. I think he's an American or Canadian. He's probably only about 30 years old, and he's done a lot of fantastic writing for young street photographers. And his blog and his website are very interesting stuff. So I'll put a link to that as well. And please just have a look through these as you begin your exercises this week. What you leave in and what you leave out of the frame makes all the difference. Consider what happens when you have leading lines. Consider where your eye is led, or where the audience's eye will be led by the placement that you give elements in your frame, etc. What happens when you move elements around? Now, of course, you're not actually getting out there and moving them so much as moving your point of view. And that's what Joel talks about in his little video as well. But the result is the same. The composition is a two-dimensional image framed by the perimeter of the photograph, and all the elements in it have a relationship to each other, part to part, part to the frame, and the whole to each part, just as James Joyce spoke. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great week. Enjoy your exercises. Thank you for your efforts with assessment 1.